Greetings, A-Push Nation! Guinea, why are you giving me kisses? Hello, this is Mr. Majewski. I'm here to discuss urbanization with you all. And of course, my Vice President, right, also my Secretary of War / Defense, alright, also my favorite child, alright. Vice President Guinness is here with me. We're going to get started on urbanization because this is going to take us a while. And so, Mr. Guinea, is it all right if Pops puts you down on the couch? The vice presidential couch. There you go. Hopefully you can get comfortable. If not, I am right next to you here. Let's go ahead and get started with urbanization. A lot of notes here that we need to get through today. All right. So urbanization during the Gilded Age. Obviously, urbanization means the movement of Americans into cities, urban areas. And obviously, that is, well, something that takes place at the same time that industrialization is taking place as well. So in the late 19th century, American cities dominated by large urban centers. We become an urban nation where more people live in cities than outside of them. There's explosive urban growth. I mean, just ridiculous growth in the cities to where they really can't keep up with the incredible population growth. Some amazing changes, new innovations, new inventions. Also disturbing changes to many people, right? New immigrants that are going to be kind of overcrowded in crowded slums. There's going to be new religious outlooks that develop. There's going to be conflicts over culture and values. There is any time that two groups of people who otherwise haven't been together are thrust together into a group atmosphere. So anyways, let's get our way through this. All right, I'm going to jump ahead here through these Venn diagram slides because we don't need them because we've already kind of hit on these. All right, urbanization, what is it? Well, population doubled to 80 million people in 1900. So it doubled since 1870 from 40 million to 80 million. We're going to be at 105 million by 1920. So, I mean, we're talking about unprecedented growth that really doesn't happen in industrialized countries. It was massive. And not only was our population booming during this time, and almost all of it from immigration, or at least a large amount, populations in cities tripled as well. All right, so by 1900, 40% of our country lives in cities. If you remember, in previous units, it had been very small. The cities grow so much that New York City had 3.5 million people by 1900. It is the second largest city in the world. One of the key reasons why we see the growth of cities are skyscrapers. Skyscrapers are obviously buildings that are built upward. They really maximize space. Look, property values in cities are expensive because land is at a premium. There's not a lot of it. There's never enough of it. And so by building skyscrapers, building upwards, you're taking advantage of limited amount of real estate that you have to buy land. And then you can really build up and up and up and up and make more and more profit with every level that you build. Skyscrapers could not be built until we developed steel. Steel is a heavier version of iron. It's a heavier metal. It is able for us to withstand these huge heavy loads that these massive skyscrapers required. The very first skyscraper was actually very modest. It was very small. It was called the Home Insurance Building in Chicago. It would not be what we would describe as a skyscraper today. However, at the time, it was revolutionary for having as many levels as that building did. It was something that a lot of folks believed couldn't take place, that it would crumble, that it would collapse. But it didn't, and then from there, we just see the incredible growth of skyscrapers. There's probably nobody that's more well-known for building skyscrapers than Louis Sullivan. He's our most famous architect, especially during this era. He believed that form followed function. So what that means is the designs are relatively simplistic. They're usually kind of, your traditional kind of rectangular or square shape. There's not a lot of intricate design. Everything is supposed to allow for the greatest amount of efficiency, to minimize the usage of space. And so we would probably describe these buildings as a little bit old looking, a little bit boring, but they were designed to not have any extra space. They were designed to use every little bit of space that was possible. That's kind of what his designs were. One of his famous buildings is the Wainwright Building. There it is. A lot of folks really considered that to be our first true skyscraper. which was built in 1891 thanks to Sullivan. We see the building of the Flatiron Building here on this next slide. Hopefully you're following along with the video. And you can see again kind of the stages, right? From beginning to middle to the end. And you'll notice again very narrow, angular designs, right? These are not supposed to be like artistic designs or anything like that so much as they fulfill a role, they fulfill a function, and they really used the space that was available. Here you see a corner lot, and so the building has been designed to maximize the incredible amount of space. This is the Flatiron Building in New York. The weird angle of the space is reflected in the angle of the building itself, which was taking every last inch of space available in order to build it. There's another view of the Flatiron Building. Again, you can see how it's kind of designed on a corner, right? That's what the property was, and so he built upward from there. And again, you notice he's really just taking advantage in as efficient a way as possible of the space that is available. All right, Chrysler Building, left, 1930. Empire State Building on the right, also 1930. We're seeing larger, bigger, better, more dynamic, more beautiful, I think you could say, more awe-inspiring buildings as we get into the 1900s, 1910s, 20s, and 30s. All right, and again, this doesn't really tell us much, other than as time goes by, you're noticing buildings getting taller, 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 and taller. And the One World Trade Center, which we built after the Twin Towers fell, is currently the largest building in New York City, and I believe the largest in the United States as well. It's not just skyscrapers that we build. We now are able to build suspension bridges, massive bridges like Golden Gate Bridge, like Brooklyn Bridge in New York. This linked Manhattan and Brooklyn. I don't know if people realize this, but New York is really a series of boroughs or towns that are separated by waterways like rivers. And so the only way to connect these different parts of the city is to build these huge, massive suspension bridges, which were really unable to be built at this time. It was key having steel and other resources that you needed in order to build these massive bridges that could accommodate people, goods, in huge numbers. So suspension bridges, another reason why we see the incredible growth of cities, new architectural wonders like skyscrapers and these new bridges. All right. John Roebling was our famous bridge designer. I'm not sure if you need to really know him or not, but again, just like Louis Sullivan with skyscrapers, John Roebling with suspension bridges. All right, there is the Brooklyn Bridge. It was considered a architectural wonder when it was built. All of these were. These were, I mean, massive infrastructure projects that really defied anything that had been built before. And so they were very much viewed as wonders, as achievements, as something that the city and the country really could be proud of. All right. Other innovations in cities that helped to contribute to the incredible growth of them: mass transportation. We see the development of the electric streetcar. We normally consider that a trolley, right? There's the trolley car there in the back, and it's traveling on electric rails, right? Just like you would see, at San Francisco or at Disneyland. Both of those are supposed to replicate that. Folks, this was the major mass transportation that existed during this time, the trolley. In fact, they're sometimes called the streetcar. A lot of folks moved to what were called streetcar suburbs, which were neighborhoods located towards the outside of town. They could connect with the streetcar. They could ride into town on the streetcar, avoid the traffic, avoid the congestion, get to their jobs, get to the shops, maybe even get to schools, and then take the streetcar back to their homes and to their peaceful, kind of quiet neighborhoods further outside of the city on a daily basis. All right. We also start to see the development of subway systems. Our first subway systems are developed in major American cities, especially on the East Coast. New York City is considered to have the best subway system in the U.S. and one of the best in the world. It starts to get built during this time where portions of the city are connected by a subway, which of course is a train system that operates underground. All right. Here we actually see a portion, and I don't know if folks realize this as well, a lot of the time subways are actually part of the subway, are actually elevated. They run above the city on raised tracks. I know in Chicago, this is actually much more common than the underground trains. Almost all the trains run above ground on these raised, elevated platforms that help to run the subway. The largest cities became what we call megalopolises. All right, what we mean is a mega city. And it's really divided into districts, almost like a business district, a residential district, or maybe a group of them, a series of them. An industrial district. Usually there was some sort of like wharf or pier or port area that was a separate district from the rest of the city as well. So as you travel, you recognized, oh, I'm going in from a residential area to a commercial one where there's a lot of stores, a lot of shops. Cities provided incredible opportunities. First off, commercial districts emerged, stores. Department stores are going to form during this time in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Our very first department stores are places like Sears, and Macy's is formed in 1906. And so these were massive stores that allowed for the purchase of goods all in one kind of venue, and they oftentimes clustered together. So a lot of the times you could hit multiple stores, department stores, in the same area within the same commercial district. This revolutionized society. People become much more consumers. Advertising and other things are going to matter a lot more. And people would flood into cities a lot of time to take advantage of these department stores that were located there. There's also plenty of new entertainment that's out there, tons of entertainment options, inside the city, even in some instances outside of the city. Electricity is something that is really unique to cities during this time. So if you wanted to take advantage of all of the lights, all of the activity, all of the action, usually that meant you were moving to or living in a city. Indoor plumbing is something that we take for granted today, but really it only existed in many in the American cities at the time. Didn't exist in rural areas. And so again, you want to take advantage of these benefits in society, these amazing new innovations and inventions. Chances are you were moving to cities to do so. All right, telephones. Our original telephones are not like telephones today. You had to be connected by a wire to the person whom you were calling via a switchboard. And so our original telephone systems usually only extended across a particular city. They oftentimes didn't extend further than that until we developed better telephone wires down the road. So early telephones really were popular and used in urban areas. Outside of those urban areas, much less common. All right? This is actually an anti-department store cartoon that you might want to pay attention to. What do you see? This little bat or this creature is greed. I think we all know what greed is. And what has greed done? Greed has built a nest here like this bat or this bird would. Only in this instance, you'll notice it has a bunch of skulls in the nest that are lining the nest. Those skulls are supposed to represent small stores, all right, small mom and pop operations that were swallowed up or went out of business because they couldn't compete with the lower prices of the much larger department store. Oftentimes the department stores were supported by corporations, and the small stores, the mom and pops, die out, right? And these are supposed to represent the various people whose mom and pop stores, the small kind of neighborhood store that went out of business. All right, keep on. Career opportunities for women. Yeah, nobody really benefits from a lot of these new opportunities in urban areas as much as women did, especially young women, unmarried women, who were still able to oftentimes get a job. Once they get married, obviously there'll be more pressure for them to lose that job and to go back into the home again. Career opportunities for women that uniquely popped up during this era. Social workers, all right? We have a lot of women and children especially that are suffering in cities. A lot of times governments, cities especially, would hire people to assist with handing out aid, providing help to these folks, maybe advice, maybe therapy. A lot of times social workers' job it was to coordinate all this and to help folks that were in need, especially women and children in urban areas. Secretaries, right? Obviously, a lot of times secretaries, typewriter is a new invention. The telephone, these were predominantly inventions that helped business. A lot of bosses, managers hired secretaries in order to assist them. These secretaries were overwhelmingly female. Store clerks, the people at the front counter, all right, that are taking your order or are handling your transaction. They were almost always girls, women, especially young, attractive ones, because bosses felt like having a young, attractive girl at the front counter led people, especially men, to buy more products. Seamstresses, right? Sewers, all right? Tailors, women that can sew in particular can make alterations to men's and women's clothing. They become a big business or a new business that develops, especially with the development of the, help me out here, sewing machine. Telephone operators as well, right? Remember, when you called someone, you called the operator and said, operator, connect me to this number. The operator actually plugged you into what was called a switchboard. And you talked to that person through the switchboard. And then when you were done, they removed that plug from the switchboard, so you were disconnected from them. So what this meant was, one, you had to have telephone operators in order to make a telephone call during this time, because they actually physically connected you to the other person via the switchboard. Secondly, telephone operators oftentimes were able to overhear the conversation you were having. Bookkeepers as well. A bookkeeper is an accountant, right? So as more and more money is being made a lot of times in businesses, they wanted somebody to record it, right? To be able to keep a balance, right? To keep your profits and losses and help you manage your money. And that's what a bookkeeper did for businesses. Those were almost always women's jobs at the time that uniquely opened up thanks to the new opportunities in American cities. Over 5 million women worked for wages by 1900. Yes, castes or social classes emerged. What we mean by that is, of course, poor American women, and especially minorities, people of color, or immigrants, tended to work lower level jobs, whereas white women, white Protestant women in particular, more connected women tended to work better jobs. One thing I will say, again, once a woman is married, it's going to be very difficult for her to maintain that job. Societal pressure meant oftentimes back into the home with her. All right. Here we see telephone operators operating in Oregon. Again, we can kind of see the switchboard in action where you called them. Through their headphones, they heard you. They connected you to whomever it was that you wanted to talk to. You'll notice all women. All right. Class distinctions did become the worst in American history up to this point. What that meant was, again, as has been the case with pretty much every set of notes, wealthier people had more and more wealth. Smaller group of people owned more of the wealth. The super rich, especially the Nouveau rich, right, remember, kind of flaunted, lived extravagantly, lived excessively. Then there was the wealthy or the well-to-do class. They were not at the Nouveau rich level, but they were still upper-class Americans. Then came the middle class. Middle class would be kind of folks that are not wealthy but not impoverished, all right, not living what we would call a life of poverty. A lot of the times they worked in more business or office jobs, all right, less working with their hands at this time. Next step is the working class. The working class were on the bottom. Those concluded everybody from factory workers to lower. Those are the folks that usually were a little bit more struggling on a day-to-day and a week-to-week and a month-to-month basis. They oftentimes took the lower jobs, the less skilled jobs, whereas middle and wealthier would take higher skilled jobs. For them, this was the biggest struggle during this era. Industrialization was good for them in some ways, but it was harsh in others. Terrible conditions that existed in cities. Look, crime is terrible. We're overcrowded. We have a lot of people that are working, but we have a lot that aren't. And so a lot of those folks looked to crime as a means of resolving their lack of income. All right, so crime is rampant in American cities. Not major crimes a lot of the times. It was pickpocketing, things like that. Maybe even crimes of vice like prostitution or gambling. But needless to say, crime was much higher during this time in our overcrowded cities as it was any time before. Unsanitary conditions were harsh and brutal in a lot of these neighborhoods, especially the working class neighborhoods. We're overcrowded. Oftentimes we do not have adequate sewage. So we have, back overflows. All right, we have problems with raw sewage getting into our waterways. A lot of times we did not have a lot of fresh water available. Heating, air conditioning. Heating obviously is a problem. There's not a lot of ventilation in a lot of the apartments that have been built, and a lot of what are called the tenements, which were apartments that were quickly built, which could lead to breathing issues. When a fire broke out, and those do happen a lot, led to safety issues. Those dumbbell tenements went up like a matchbox. All right, speaking of dumbbell tenements, what are they? They were tenements that were rapidly built around the late 1800s and early 1900s as builders tried to frantically keep up with the incredible number of people that swarmed into their cities. And so they threw out these really, really short-term, rickety apartments that were copycats of one another. If you looked at them from above, they kind of looked like a dumbbell, right? Like a weight that a weightlifter lifts. And they were designed to try to take advantage of as little space as possible and put as many families as possible in here as comfortably as you could. The problem is they're usually overcrowded, which means more families live in these places than we're supposed to. There was only 1 or 2 bathrooms for the entire floor. Those almost always got clogged up. There was very little lighting and ventilation. There were almost no windows. And there was really only one exit, which was in the center of the building, which oftentimes meant that if there was a problem, then a fire, for instance, then these things turned into death traps as time went by. All right. Anyways, you should know what a dumbbell tenement is. It's these terrible apartments that are built in American cities that led to horrible conditions, overcrowding, and eventually a lot of safety hazards as well. So again, we have a criticism of the rent question in this cartoon. You see the rich industrialist there. What's he doing? Why not build $1,000 cottages and let them to our laboring classes at $12 a month so they may breathe pure air? It would be a paving investment, right? So the question here is, why can we not build actual cottages or small homes for families? Why must we build these massive overcrowded tenements that clogged up the streets, that looked terrible, that were death traps and hazards that most people were forced to live in because they had no other housing answer? There's another one. You can kind of see the typical tenement neighborhood. You're noticing it's overcrowded. You got wires going everywhere, right? There's no walkways. People are really battling with horse and buggy and horses and stuff to move across the street. You'll notice in this instance there's been a storm, so we see a lot of what looks like rain or snow. A lot of trash along the edges here. And folks, the idea here is that this rain and snow is mixed with human waste. And so it just leads to a lot of disease, a lot of misery, a lot of harsh conditions. Cities, especially working class neighborhoods, were rough. They were tough living. They presented a lot of problems, especially in these overcrowded areas. We're familiar already with political machines, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on them. But you need to know cities were also dominated by political machines, right? Remember, they had formed as a result of the spoils system. When Andrew Jackson created the spoils system, remember, he was looking to develop loyalty from the people in his party. What happened was, in many American cities along the East Coast, Democratic Party, even sometimes Republican, but usually Democratic Party, machines developed where that party absolutely dominated and controlled that city. The other party really didn't exist, or if it did, it was just beaten badly in every major election. And then, of course, what did machines do? Remember, they took advantage of the votes of their people, right? In exchange for their votes, they provided basic services, right, like jobs, like homes, like city services. And if you didn't vote the way the machine wanted you to, the machine boss, the party, then you were denied those things. All right, so it was a way for especially immigrants to be controlled immediately when they arrived in the country. In fact, a lot of times political machines would have their representatives on the dock waiting for immigrants to get off the boat to sign them up to register them as members of their party. The most famous is Tammany Hall. It's located in New York. It's run by a guy named William Boss Tweed. Boss Tweed, actually, thanks to Thomas Nast, it's Thomas Nast who exposes this guy and basically lets the public know, hey, there's this dude named Boss Tweed, and he represents these political machines. He's the worst of the worst. He absolutely controls politics in New York City, and he's kind of contributing to some of the problems, the corruption, the greed that a lot of people are seeing. If you wanted, for instance, your construction company wanted contracts, you wanted to build something, you had to bribe him, you had to give him money, you had to get his approval. So again, these guys get very wealthy very quickly by taking advantage of the power they had in cities to control people and to control all activities that existed there. All right, I'm going to skip over George Washington Plunkett because I'm not sure that we need to cover him. Now, a lot of reformers want to see something done here to end the Tammany Hall domination, what they considered to be one party controlling an area, which was bad. This is a very famous, I'm going to skip over the quote, we don't need it. This is a very famous political cartoon. It's asking, hey, who stole the people's money? And what do we see? We see members of Tammany Hall, and each of them, if you can see, is kind of pointing to the next guy, pointing to the next guy, pointing to the next guy. And there's Boss Tweed right in the front, right? Kind of the big, kind of overweight looking guy. That's Boss Tweed. So the question is, who stole the money? It's all of these guys, everybody that's part of the machine, because the machine is stealing people's money. It's corrupting elections. It's getting immigrants to vote for a guy, not because he's the best candidate, because he's going to provide them with money or other favors. That businesses were paying money to these guys in order to get successful or in order to have their products bought or sold in their city. So these guys get filthy rich, and it's basically based on a corrupt, greedy system. All right. This is a very famous image, again by Nast, again attacking Boss Tweed. Here it's Boss Tweed with his arm next to the ballot, right? The ballot box, right? And it says, in counting, there is strength. So the message here is, hey, whoever counts the votes, right? Whoever counts the ballot box has a lot of power, has a lot of strength, because they get to kind of determine the outcome. And if it's a corrupt official like Boss Tweed, you got to pay him, essentially, if you want to win the election. And here he is with the famous one of his quotes down there at the bottom. As long as I count the votes, what are you going to do about it? Say? Like, what are you going to do? Huh? So anyways, these are powerful. They convince the American public, not just in New York City, but around the country, that machines are bad, that something needs to be done to break them up, because they're bad for the country, they're bad for politics, they're bad for elections. And the corruption and greed needed to be stopped in the United States. Here's another one. It's Boss Tweed again. You'll notice he never gets depicted in any other way, but as this kind of big, giant, massive man. Only this instance, he's called the brains that achieved the Tammany victory. Only in this instance, what is he? His face has been replaced by a bag of money. All right, so there's Boss Tweed, the machine boss. Being depicted to be so greedy, right, that literally his head has turned into a bag of money. All right, let's keep this train going. Oh, the Tammany Tiger loses, right? What are you going to do about it, right? The Tammany Tiger is loose, I should say. The tiger is supposed to represent Tammany Hall. There you can see Boss Tweed up there acting like Caesar, right, like an emperor. He and his other members of his party are all watching what happens and what has happened here. Lady Liberty, right, as you can see, has been attacked. She has been killed, right? She represents, democracy, republicanism, morality, all the things that's supposed to make America great. And what has happened? The Tammany Tiger has mauled and killed her, right? And you'll notice the ballot box has been broken in the background, like the Tammany Hall Tiger has destroyed the ballot, has destroyed the vote as well, which means he has controlled it. So again, you're noticing the machine being depicted as evil, as bad, as big, as corrupt, as trying to dominate society. Can't get enough of this, right? What are you laughing at? To the victor belong the spoils. Again, we see Boss Tweed here, and he clearly is not having as good of a day. Obviously, this is after Boss Tweed and Tammany Hall were starting to be broken up. All right, so as you can see here, he's being depicted as somebody that's a little shell-shocked, that's been... maybe the emperor wears no clothes, which means he's not as strong as he used to be. Basically just talking about celebrating the fact that Tammany Hall is finally being broken up as we get into the 1870s. All right. There were plenty of other political machines you needed to be aware of. That was just kind of the most common, the most well-known. Let's get into new immigration, right? Obviously, old immigration was the immigrants that had come previously. They were mostly Anglo-Saxon, which meant they were mostly English and German. They included some Scandinavians. And then in 1850 to 1860, and then 60 to 70, 70 to 80, we get 6 million more immigrants that arrive from those areas. So prior to 1880, almost all of the immigrants in this country were German or Irish. They're all considered to be part of old immigration, all right? They spoke the similar languages of the people that were there. They didn't really change society. Most of them are Protestant as well, or at least a large percentage of them were. Even then, because some of these Germans and Irish are Catholic, they still were met with nativism, right, by the know-nothings and other groups. Despite all of this anti-immigrant mentality or mindset, Germans were the largest, Irish were the second largest groups in this country by 1900. So old immigration was English mixed with German and Irish, all right? And yes, they did get persecuted, especially the Irish, but ultimately nothing like the persecution that the groups that come after them experience. All right, remember, Germans settled in the Midwest. They settled in farming communities. They could usually afford to buy land because they had some they had some money from the land they had sold in Europe. So they tended to cluster in cities, but also in farms. And they tended to stay very close-knit with one another, the Germans did, and establish farming communities for the most part. The Irish were very different. Remember, the Irish had to cluster in cities. They were poor. They were coming from the famine and other problems. They could not afford farms, so they took low-skill, low-paying jobs in cities. Oftentimes, they too clustered in urban areas in those working-class neighborhoods and simply tried to survive. All right, we're getting the spinning wheel of death. I'm going to skip that. Oh, my goodness. Look at some of this resistance to these immigrants, even to the Irish and the Germans, who are nothing like the groups that come after them. Here we go. Here's, this is really racist and bigoted. Here we have Florence Nightingale, who's considered to be like a perfect British gal. She was a nurse. She helped people. She was a humanitarian. She's depicted kind of as a decent-looking gal, maybe a little bit tired, but who isn't? Compare her with this image of the Irish woman. This is supposed to be a typical Irish woman. They've given her the name Bridget McBruiser. And you notice how she's depicted as a mongrel, right? How she looks almost like animal-like she's subhuman, not even at the same level as other English. What this is saying is, hey, we got to do something about these new immigrants into the country because they're changing the country for the worse. They're making it more Catholic. They're making it less English. And they're changing the original groups that were here and making them look more like mongrels, which is what she's supposed to represent. All right, here's another one, right? The Irish way of doing things. Let's notice this is a Nast cartoon. He was hardcore anti-Irish and anti-Catholic. And here we see, right, you got the Irish guy, again, depicted more like an animal than a person. What is he doing? He's drunk, he's drinking, he's causing problems here with his little pickaxe. And he's sitting on a barrel of gunpowder, right? The message is, it's only a moment here before he's going to light the gunpowder. He's going to cause problems. He's going to cause explosions around this country. By explosions, they meant things like riots, right? So the message is, if we let more of these Irish people in here, then it's going to lead to violence against us. It's going to lead to alcoholism. It's going to lead to the downfall of American society. So again, these Irish folks, here's another good one. Mother Earth, Lady Liberty, what is she doing? She's kind of assimilating, which means she is mixing all of these groups together to form one American race. What is the spoon she's using to do so? Equal rights. Only who's the character in here that is not allowing themselves to be assimilated, that is not blending into society? It's the Irish guy. And what is the Irish guy doing? He's showing too much loyalty to Ireland with the green flag. You notice he's got a knife there, which is a symbol for violence, that he's going to cause crime or violence, that he's a drunk, that he's causing problems, that he's a troublemaker, and that he can't blend in with the rest of society. The message is clear here, right? All these other immigrants are blending in and becoming citizens. We need to do something about these Irish, or else we need to get rid of them. Another one, Uncle Sam's Troublesome Bedfellows, right? And there's Uncle Sam. He's got all these different characters that represent different immigrant groups in this country, all of them a little racist in their own way. What has happened here? Oh, you notice Uncle Sam has just kicked out the Chinese guy and the Irish guy that came before him, right? So the message here is, these guys are troublemakers, they're troublesome, they cause violence, they don't follow rules, they riot, these sorts of things, and they need to be gotten rid of for the benefit of everybody else. All right, by the way, this was a San Francisco newspaper because, of course, California led the opposition to Chinese immigration, like people on the East Coast led opposition to Irish immigration. All right. So Thomas Nast, the ignorant vote, honors are easy, right? He's basically saying there's both ignorant whites, those were supposed to be the Irish. There are ignorant votes being made in the South, those are supposed to be blacks. And they're kind of evening each other out or kind of weighing the entire system down. So obviously Nast is more of a Republican because both of these groups would have tended to vote Democrat. And he's basically arguing that there are too many ignorant people, uneducated, uninformed people that are voting and affecting the outcomes for all of the rest of us. All right? Now, if that wasn't bad enough, during this era that we're actually talking about now with urbanization, we get an entirely new wave of immigrants that show up in way larger numbers than ever before. This is the peak of our immigration into this country. 27 million people come between 1880 and 1920. Now, 11 million do return, but still, that's plus 16 million people that immigrated to this country in 40 years. Most came from Southern and Eastern Europe. There's your big change. No longer from Germany and Ireland, no longer from England, no longer from Northern and Western Europe. We're going to see them now come from Southern and Eastern Europe instead. Here come the Majewskis, hide the silverware. By 1910, 1/3 of Americans are going to be foreign-born or had one parent that were foreign-born. We become an immigrant nation during this time. All right. And I believe, yes, if you notice here, in 1920, where are the majority of Americans coming from? Well, we still have a lot from Northern and Western Europe, all right? If we asked all the immigrants, where did you come from, you'll notice it's a large number of Northern and Western Europe. That's Germans, Irish, and English. But notice this new group that has suddenly become overwhelmingly dominant as well. These are the Southern and Eastern Europeans. These are Italians and Greeks and Poles and Russians and Jews. These are Romanians, all right? These are all of the folks from the other parts of Europe that had not traditionally come over at this time. They are almost all unskilled, low-wage laborers who were looking for wealth and or land for themselves. Most of them came through this place. It's Ellis Island, which was our immigration center where everybody was transported through before they could be admitted as a citizen into this country. It's not like today. If you showed up here and you were naturalized, you immediately became a citizen on the spot. All right? So most came through Ellis Island on the East Coast. If you were out west, you came through another depot near San Francisco called Angel Island. There's Ellis Island today. It's kind of a landmark today. It's right next to the Statue of Liberty. So immigrants would see the Statue of Liberty, which was kind of like the unofficial welcome, right? And then they were dropped off at Ellis Island where they were naturalized, they were processed, they were naturalized at, and that means turned into citizens. All right? So like I said, they sail past that Statue of Liberty on their way into the United States. New immigrants tended to live together in their own neighborhoods in big cities like New York and Chicago. So there would be German neighborhoods, Irish neighborhoods, there would be Polish neighborhoods, Greek neighborhoods, Russian, Jewish neighborhoods. My grandparents, when they emigrated here on both sides, came through Ellis Island in New York. One of my sides of the family moved to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania to work in the coal mines for a while before relocating to Chicago into a Polish neighborhood. The others went directly to a Polish neighborhood in Chicago. So they moved into what we call enclaves, which are ethnic neighborhoods where people from the same ethnicity, same country, same nationality tend to cluster together because it's always easier to live amongst people who you speak the same language with, who you share the same customs, religion, culture, tradition, foods with. It's easier to assimilate into society when you have people that are like you and speak your language and know who you are and your way of life. It always makes it a little bit easier. All right. Many of these folks are Orthodox Christians. They're Jews. A large majority are Catholic. These are all new faiths that Protestants in this country were fearful of. Protestants felt like all of these religions were coming over in such massive numbers that they were overwhelming or swamping Protestants, and we would no longer be a Protestant country in the future, which is, of course, something that many Americans did not want to see happen. Most came from countries with very little democracy. What that means is, one, they want to participate in democracy, but two, a lot of these folks didn't really support democratic ideas as much as Americans did. Some of these folks are communists, some of them are socialists, some of them are anarchists, and they bring some of these more extreme views with them, especially since many of them weren't familiar with how democracy worked and were used to harsher systems where people took matters into their own hands. They were mostly illiterate, overwhelmingly illiterate population that comes from Europe during this time, which means they're resigned or they're stuck in a lot of lower-paying, low-skilled jobs. New immigrants struggled to maintain their cultures in the U.S., you better believe it. Some of these groups, especially the Irish, formed Catholic school systems. The Jews did the same. They formed Hebrew schools. It was a way for them to preserve their language and religion, despite the fact that they oftentimes were being forced to assimilate in other areas of life. And of course Protestants felt like the Catholic school system and the Jewish school system were threats to them and threats to this country. They worried, what are kids learning in those systems? Why do these people feel like they need to be taught in completely separate schools? The real reason was because the Catholics and the Jews were worried if they sent their kids to regular public schools that they would be brainwashed into just believing in white Anglo-Saxon Protestant beliefs. Which they didn't want to see happen. We also see the development of foreign language newspapers in many cities, especially in these ethnic enclaves. We see foreign language theaters, movie theaters and otherwise, food stores, restaurants, and grocery stores that specifically catered to the food items from these countries. Restaurants, obviously, Italian restaurants and Greek restaurants, Polish food, all of these sorts of restaurants developed in certain ethnic neighborhoods. Parishes, which is church congregations, right? So we see foreign language churches. For instance, Greek Orthodox churches oftentimes spoke in Greek during their ceremonies, right? Social clubs were founded. The Basque Club, the Greek Club, the Polish Club in a city, in a neighborhood, where people from that group could get together for social gatherings, social engagements that were put on by that social club. All right. The first generations of Americans often rejected parts of their parents' culture. They became more mainstreamed. And so, therefore, newer generations, younger Americans, tended to assimilate faster. They tended to reject some of these old customs. All right. Why was there so much immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe? Well, there was overpopulation in Europe. 2, the U.S. was viewed as a land of opportunity, and that was a big draw. America's a land of freedom. It's a land of opportunity. It's a land of all of these amazing things. And so a lot of Europeans viewed it as, oh my God, I can own land. I'm not in debt to somebody, hopefully. I'm not a serf. I can actually choose the job I want. I can negotiate my wages. I can potentially buy my own place and even my own farm down the road. Why else were Southern and Eastern European immigrants so overwhelming? Well, because businesses wanted them. They needed low-wage labor. And they knew most Americans were not going to, as time goes by, continue to work in these low-wage jobs. They knew that they would want more, that they would work for more, that they would demand more. And so they wanted a steady supply of immigrants to fill in for those Americans and to take those low-wage jobs as other Americans left them. There was also a lot of persecution of minorities in Europe. Jews were being persecuted in Russia, for instance. And so some of these groups left the persecution. They escaped into a place like the United States, which was known for its freedom of religion. All right. Now, it should be mentioned, a lot of immigrants, about 1 in 4, did return home during this era. But obviously the numbers that are arriving and staying dwarfed those that were going back. One of the first groups to actually be outlawed from the United States were the Chinese. Even before other groups were outlawed, it was the Chinese, or I should say were restricted. The Chinese were almost completely banned, in fact were banned by the 1880s. Now, originally it hadn't been the case. The Chinese were welcomed at first. The Burlingame Treaty opened up relations between the U.S. and China and allowed Chinese male immigrants to arrive. Why? Well, because we needed workers for the Transcontinental Railroad. Some of these Chinese workers were skilled at this, and by 1870, 9% of our population in California, at least on the West Coast, is of Chinese descent. Like I mentioned, Chinese immigrants came through not Ellis Island, but Angel Island. They became a key part of our country, especially our West Coast. They did a number of different jobs, including a lot of like laundry-related jobs. They did a lot of sewing. They were launderers. They worked on railroads. They worked in mining. So they did a number of different tasks and or jobs in this country. They were a key part of our economy. The problem was a lot of Californians resented them. One, they resented the fact that a lot of these Chinese people, especially men, that were coming over, they felt weren't assimilating into American society well enough. And a lot of American workers, especially in California, felt like these Chinese workers were a threat to them, were taking their jobs or taking jobs for lower wages than other Americans would have worked. And so a group known as the Working Men's Party of California, they're a union. Early unions were called Working Men's Party. They led the resistance and the opposition to Chinese immigrants, and they were brutal. They were harsh. They got the media, the newspapers out west to portray Chinese, again, as subhuman, as kind of animals. Eventually, in 1882, we get the Chinese Exclusion Act. It excluded Chinese. It's basically, its purpose was in the title. It banned all Chinese immigration into this country all the way until 1943. It was illegal for Chinese immigrants to enter. And this was the great fear of the period. At least this is what nativists wanted you to believe, that Uncle Sam would be swallowed up by foreigners. We've got the Chinese guy here. We've got the Irish immigrant here. What are they doing between them? They're swallowing up Uncle Sam, who's representing the United States. They're overwhelming us, these people would have said. Here, they're continuing to finish the job. Now, I don't know what's happened here, other than it looks like the Chinese and the Irish immigrant have become one. And now they appear to be turning on one another. Alrighty. So again, we're seeing kind of how Uncle Sam gets swallowed up, right? After Uncle Sam gets swallowed up, right? It looks to me like the Chinese guy is about to swallow up the Irish immigrant as well. All right. Hey, this was a very common practice in California. Chinese men were oftentimes discriminated against. They were brutalized. They were victimized. Violence was inflicted against them. One of the things that Californians like to do is they would cut the braids of Chinese men. A lot of single Chinese men, unmarried Chinese men, grew their hair long. It was kind of like a cultural thing. A lot of Americans, especially Californians, believed these Chinese were not assimilating, that by keeping their hair long in that braid, that it was preventing them from behaving like other quote-unquote Americans, and so they would hunt the Chinese men down, and they would then try to chop off the braid. You'll notice there's a sign here to the right in this particular image. Courts of justice are closed to the Chinese. Extra taxes to Yellow Jack. All right, Yellow Jack was kind of a derogatory term used to describe Chinese immigrants. Here we go, a picture for our employees as well. And the message here is, hey, here's the boss. God bless our home, right? Here's the typical American boss, right? He's got his wife at home, baby waiting for him as well. The kids are all excited to see him. They've got the family cat over here as well. Meanwhile, look at the employees. Who are the employees? They're a bunch of Chinese workers who are overcrowded, smashed together in this tiny little tenement or this tiny little apartment. And they're just trying to find space so that they can survive. So the message here is, hey, who's helping you guys to get wealthy, to become middle class or higher? It's these workers who are slaving away and living in terrible conditions, and don't forget it. All right? The massacre of the Chinese. Yep, we do have some incidents where Chinese immigrants were attacked, in some cases killed. The worst famous example was a massacre of the Chinese in Wyoming in 1885. Locals upset with Chinese immigrants who they viewed as taking jobs they wanted. They took out their frustration on these immigrants, and there was a mass slaughter. All right? Look at the number of immigrants coming into the country during this era. You'll notice the Chinese immigration, well, all immigration really grows, and then boom! After the Chinese Exclusion Act, you'll see how immigration kind of shuts down. At least Chinese immigration shuts down for a period of time. All right, so again, you're seeing the effects of some of these bans on immigration. Yes, again, beginning in 1888, we're going to see immigration start to increase again, but for the period here between 1882 and 1888, when Chinese immigrants were excluded, immigration went way down in this country. All right. Oh, here's another one, right? The Temple of Liberty, right, is the title of this. That's supposed to be the United States, like our border, our port, right? Here we have a Chinese guy that's trying to get into the country, right? The American is looking at his passport to determine whether he's going to allow him to cross the bridge into the United States. So the message down here, e pluribus unum. Remember, that's Latin. It means out of many, one. So out of many different people, we make one society. That's the American society. Except in parentheses, what is this cartoonist added? Out of many, one, except the Chinese, right? The message here is the Chinese are not welcome, all right? So maybe kind of pointing out some of the hypocrisy here and excluding the Chinese. If we continue on to immigration here, we'll notice that immigration for Asians continues to grow, all right? But in 1907, when Japanese immigrants are then restricted as well, then we see immigration flatline again and get almost close to zero once more. So again, Asian immigration, it goes up because early it's Chinese. Then after the Chinese exclusion, it goes down. Beginning in the 1890s, it starts to rise again as Japanese immigrants arrive. What do we do in 1907? We cut off Japanese immigration as well. All right. Again, what are the reaction to immigrants from in the United States? Well, political machines loved them. They took advantage of these new immigrants in order to trade jobs and services for those immigrant votes. They provided jobs, housing, gifts, legal services. They would provide lawyers. They would help get schools built. They would help get parks and hospitals built. They did these things near immigrant neighborhoods as long as the immigrant population voted for their candidates and put them in power. I don't want you to think political machines did nothing for immigrants. They did plenty. But the problem was the rest of American society viewed it as a corrupt system, which it kind of was. And so they wanted it to be changed. All right, they thought it was giving immigrants, especially immigrant voters, too much power. Tammany Hall got much of its power from the immigrant vote. I've already mentioned that to you multiple times. But there were clearly other political machines in Philadelphia, in Boston, in Chicago. Shoot, even in Kansas City and other places, there were Republican machines. So both parties took advantage of immigrants in order to try to expand their power in certain cities. All right. We also see social crusaders that rise up as a result of immigrants. More and more Americans stand up and want to help these masses that come into this country. Now, hey, some of them just want to make their lives better. Others want to do it because they're worried that if we don't improve the lives of these working class immigrants, eventually these immigrants are going to get so fed up and so frustrated that they may revolt, they might rise up, they might challenge society and force it to change. And so we had a number of different social movements that developed. The most famous, of course, is the social gospel movement. These are Protestant Christian reformers that wanted to go out and improve society in urban areas for the better in an effort to make society better, but also to convince these immigrants perhaps to convert to Protestantism as well. Social gospel believed in the Christian mission. They were trying to get people to kind of adopt the behaviors that they viewed as religious or Christian, and that meant they wanted a reduction of alcoholism. They wanted to see unemployment go down. All right, so they want to see more immigrants working and providing for themselves. A lot of times they wanted to try to be mediators where they would have managers and unions come into the same room, and they would try to resolve the conflict almost like a judge, but without legal authority kind of to do so. These social gospels movement leaders sparked something called progressivism, which is try to improve or fix evils in society to bring progress to us all. Some of the most famous of the social gospel leaders was a guy named Josiah Strong, who really talked about the need to improve immigrant life in this country, if anything, to protect Protestantism and to hopefully convince these folks to assimilate into a Protestant lifestyle as well. The Salvation Army, you need to know, right? They were a group that provided basic medical care and needs. They also provided things like soup kitchens, so they would feed the homeless as well. Settlement houses are one of our most famous examples of social gospel. It was a women's movement. It was generally a movement led by women for women and children. The idea here was that women and kids had special obstacles in cities that made it difficult for them to overcome. They didn't have the same opportunity as men a lot of the time. And so, therefore, many women and children lived in poverty. They lived incredibly difficult and harsh lives. And so settlement house movement is designed to fix that. It's designed to provide basic services to women, and especially women and children. They would be located in the inner city neighborhood the settlement house would be. It would almost be like a giant building and or apartment complex. And they would provide housing to women and children that were homeless. They would provide education, job skills, job training, even things like cooking training. They would provide food, clothing, all right. They would provide like recreational opportunities, like some of them had like gyms for the kids. It was basically a one building that provided all services to women and children to try to improve their lives, get them back on their feet, get them able to provide for themselves, and to become more independent and rise up in social class. Again, the most famous is Hull House. It's located in Chicago. It's run by Jane Addams. I will tell you, Hull House, I believe, just went out of business like a couple of years ago. Also, Lillian Wald is another famous settlement house leader. She worked a little bit in Chicago, but mostly in New York. These were really the centers of women's activism. They started out as organizations designed to help women and children survive and improve their lives. Over time, they became the Center for Women's Rights. They became the Center for Women's Suffrage, and many of these women later on adopted other progressive reforms that they wanted to see passed as well. Florence Kelley is a good example of that. She's a settlement house leader in New York City who later on becomes a reformer for all women and all women's rights. All right. Another famous social gospel organization is the Red Cross, founded by Clara Barton. The Red Cross, of course, provides medical care, health and medical care to people in urban areas that could otherwise not afford it. In addition to that, hey, we have municipal housekeeping, which is kind of explains what it is. We have housekeeping services that develop in cities that took advantage of immigrant labor, and oftentimes also helped immigrants with jobs. And then the YWCA is essentially a gym and outdoor area for kids. That one is particularly for women and girls. The YMCA, the Young Men's, was already in existence as well. All right, other reactions to all of these immigrants, nativism. Nativists opposed Irish immigration, and so obviously, if they opposed Irish immigration in the past, they definitely opposed this new immigration from Southern and Eastern, because Southern and Eastern Europeans were significantly more different even than the Irish, all right? A number of anti-foreign organizations developed. The most famous is the American Protective Association. It was anti-Catholic. They worked against Catholic candidates, which usually meant Irish candidates. And they basically contributed money to support Protestant candidates and to work actively against Catholic ones. Labor leaders as well opposed immigration. All right, labor unions were usually anti-immigrant. Why? Because immigrants would take jobs at lower wages than labor unions wanted. If labor union said, "Hey, nobody's going to work in this job for less than $5 a week," if immigrants came in, a lot of times they'd work for $2 or $3 or $4 a week because it was way better than what they had made in the past, and they needed to survive in these harsh urban areas. And so labor unions hated immigrants because they always broke the strike. They were always the strike breakers. They oftentimes took work as scabs or as strike breakers when other Americans were trying to fight for better wages or treatment. A lot of Protestants as well were nativist. All right, one of the reasons why we see the social gospel and these other movements, like I mentioned, is nativism. They wanted immigrants to assimilate better into society, and they believed by helping these immigrants and by showing them kindness and compassion, that it would cause those immigrants to behave kind of more like immigrants and to follow in their footsteps down the road. All right. here we go, right? Here we can see here we can see an American worker, right, who's trying to survive with his family. And what do we have? We have this immigrant who's looking like a pauper. He's looking like he's wearing a bunch of rags with holes in them and everything like that. And what is he doing? He's kind of stealing the bread. He's stealing the food of the regular American worker. So clearly, guys, this would be a cartoon that supported unions, labor unions, and felt like immigrants were hurting those unions and literally taking the food off our table behind our backs. All right. Oh, here's another one. Ike, did you get those flowers for Rachel's wedding? Yes, father, and I got paper ones so we could use them again for grandfather when grandfather dies. So this is supposed to be a Jewish family, and it's making fun of that old horrible stereotype that Jews are cheap. And that they're greedy and that they're miserly. Here, the dad has sent the kid to get flowers. The kid has bought the flowers for the sister's wedding. And what the kid says is, yeah, I bought flowers, but I made sure they were paper ones so we can use them again when grandfather dies. Right? So kind of making fun of or joking about the fact that Jews were considered to be had these negative stereotypes about them, that they were greedy, that they only bought from other Jews, that they were cheap. And so these are nativist cartoons that are reinforcing this notion, that are supporting this idea, these stereotypes about Jews, to try to get people to be turn against Jews and to try to force Jews to assimilate more into American society. Alrighty. Same deal. This is an anti-Jewish cartoon. Where the sofa literally has been turned into a money symbol, so that the dude really is reminded of money every time, everywhere he sits, everything that he does. And this guy, again, is supposed to be an American Jew, kind of, again, taking advantage of these horrible racist stereotypes that emerged. Here we go, the modern Moses, right? This is actually, that's supposed to be Uncle Sam. He's portraying the role of Moses. What is he doing? Instead of parting the Red Seas, he's parting the Atlantic Ocean and allowing this constant stream or wave of immigrants to come into the country. Yeah, all right. So again, hard to say whether this one's as critical. It looks to me like it's critical of it. You notice how Uncle Sam looks almost like possessed. And you notice how it's kind of dark and ominous, right? All of these, the storm clouds and everything like that, as these immigrants are arriving. Okay? Looking backward, they would close to the newcomer the bridge that carried them and their fathers over. All right, so this one is, this is a good cartoon. What this is attacking nativists. So what it's saying is, here's the immigrant. He's trying to cross into the United States, right? He's trying to cross the bridge into the United States. And these American guys are here blocking him. They won't let him, right? And the message is, hey, American guys here who are suddenly against immigration, remember, these were your fathers and grandfathers, these immigrants in the background. And it's almost like you've forgotten your immigrant heritage, right? By not allowing more immigrants into the country today. Wow, that one seems relevant to today with some of the disputes that are existing or are occurring over immigration policy under our new president. Here's Thomas Nast. Hey, religious liberty is guaranteed, but can we allow these foreign reptiles to crawl all over us? Here, the Roman Catholic Church, which is kind of Irish and Southern and Eastern European immigrants, is depicted as an alligator or a crocodile. The Mormon Church here is depicted as kind of a snapping turtle. And what are they doing? These lizards, these reptiles are crawling all over the United States Capitol. The message here is, we're giving these folks religious freedom, but we're allowing them to change our country for the worse. We're going to develop folks that are more loyal to the Catholic Church, that are more loyal to the Mormon Church, and are going to be less loyal to the United States if we continue to allow these immigrants in. Oh, another one. I told you, a million cartoons this time around. Here we have Thomas Nast. He's criticizing the influence the Catholic Church has on our public school system. Here, the crocodiles or the alligators that are coming up are actually dressed in the clothing of Catholic bishops and priests and cardinals and even the Pope. So here, Catholic officials are being depicted as crocodiles that are here to swallow up or take or consume American Protestant school children. So again, yet another anti-immigrant image here. All right? The business community favored immigrants. If labor unions didn't like them, corporations did. Because more immigrants there were, usually the cheaper labor, the cheaper wages that businesses had to pay. The easier it was then for to hire temporary workers, scabs, when strikes did break out. In fact, Congress didn't pass any anti-immigration legislation until the 1920s, even though the public wanted it and labor unions wanted it. Businesses did not, and we know Congress tended most of the time to side with business. This is a wonderful chart that exists here. I want you to focus on the first two groups, because these kind of show you what the difference between old immigration and new immigration was. Obviously, you can avoid post-1965 immigration. I really think you should focus on these. I think you should spend some time if you really want to know your stuff. New morality. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because this isn't as significant, but a lot of times white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, they were nicknamed WASPs. They wanted to try to preserve their way of life. They wanted to try to preserve white dominance, Anglo-Saxon, which was English and German, Protestants. They wanted to maintain their control over power and wealth in this country. And they were threatened by these waves of Catholic immigrants from Europe and by Chinese immigrants from Asia. And so they passed a number of things to try to force immigrants to assimilate into the rest of society, to try to get people to behave more like them. They developed what were called middle-class values that they expected other Americans to follow. They were very strict. They, for instance, developed anti-sexuality laws. Comstock law was the most famous, where women could be forced to... They could be arrested if, for instance, they were not wearing full covered clothing. If they challenged the ideas of how a woman was supposed to behave. If they, for instance, were out at night or traveling by themselves or in bars or other places that they weren't supposed to be, in the eyes of many other Americans, women could technically be arrested for doing so. Anti-sexuality, you weren't allowed to show skin of any type. Even like arms or shoulders were considered taboo, and could get you in trouble. All right? Oh... That's a funny one. We can skip over it, though. I don't think we need to know it. Prohibition is another really famous example. Obviously, alcohol had increased during the Civil War for obvious reasons. Soldiers wanted to drink. We had more immigrants coming into the country who tended to drink more. So in 1874, the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, formed. It was formed by a lady named Frances Willard. There she is. Over time, it ended up becoming the most powerful women's organization in this country. All right, so it starts just by focusing on temperance, drinking less, and overall it turns into this massive women's organization that fought for women's rights, equality, and suffrage. Other famous anti-alcohol Americans that emerged during this time, Carrie Nation. She was radical. There she is. She was known, for instance, her and her supporters for going into bars and literally with sledgehammers and hammers and other things and destroying all the liquor that existed there to try to get their men to stop drinking. All right. We also had an anti-saloon league. It was mostly men. It was male-dominated. And they tended to actually achieve more because they were able to get laws passed that outlawed or reduced alcohol consumption. Because they were men, they oftentimes were better able to work with male politicians in power. All right. Generally speaking, states began to prohibit alcohol as we get into the 1880s, 90s, and 1900s. And a lot of this was because a lot of social gospel reformers, a lot of Americans, especially WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, believed alcohol was something that was being brought over and abused by immigrants. And by reducing alcohol consumption, it would lead to more immigrants assimilating or blending into American society. Women's liberation and suffrage, during this time, women were becoming more independent. There were more women living in the cities. We had our two women's organizations merged together during this time. The National American Women's Suffrage Association was formed. It included these titans, these just massively important leaders of the suffrage movement, Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. They didn't have a lot of success until the 1900s. but they start to draw more attention to women's voting, to women's suffrage, and to women's rights. All right? They and the WCTU really were the leading suffrage organizations in this country all the way up until the 1910s. All right? And of course, a lot of them wanted the vote, not only to vote for president and other positions, but so that they could hopefully pass laws that would abolish alcohol as well. Gains for women, well, there's a lot of them during this time that you need to be aware of. Some highlights. Women did vote in local and state elections more. They were denied the right to vote in federal ones. Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, Idaho did grant full suffrage to women, so they were the first states to allow women to vote. You'll notice those are western states where women were granted generally more freedom, more liberty, because they were dependent on more to provide work, especially in populations out west in those states that were not very large. Most states by 1890 had granted women property rights after they got married. This was something that the women had been working on since the early 1800s. Religion, I mentioned to you, churches confronted these urban challenges in a lot of ways as well. Oh my goodness, we're almost done. Our churches tried to confront these challenges as well. Charles Darwin really kind of attacked churches, started a movement where people began to become less religious when he developed the theory of evolution. Now, he wrote a famous book, The Origin of Species. He focused on some birds that he studied. And what he basically said was, hey, as time goes by, we evolve. Species evolve in order to survive. And the strong ones evolve and develop, changes that allow them to survive, and weaker ones die out. All right? And they don't develop these changes, and they're the first to go. So the idea was, species improve as time goes by, genetically, biologically. We build bigger, stronger, and better versions of ourselves as time goes by. Here's the thing, is that evolution was a challenge to the Bible, to the literal interpretation of the Bible, which many Protestants and Catholics adhered to in this country, right? Because basically what it's saying is that God isn't really the creator of these of species and of these changes. That modern science is, that we biologically mutate from one to another. And a lot of folks that were religious viewed this as an attack upon their religion and an attack upon the Bible. And so if you believed in the ideas of evolution, and if you started to challenge the old religious interpretations of how the world was created and how humans and species were created, you were called a modernist because you believed in these modern ideas like evolution. If you rejected these modern views and you wanted to protect your traditional view of the Bible or of Christianity, you adopted what was called a fundamentalist belief. So it was a fight during this era between fundamentalists and modernists, kind of over a lot of social and religious issues. The most famous modernists were people like Henry Ward Beecher, but as time goes by, younger Americans tended to be more modernist, older Americans tended to be more fundamentalist. We saw a lot of rifts or disagreements develop between these two groups on colleges and within certain churches, especially at colleges where a lot of younger students adopted modernism, a scientific view of life, whereas older people on those campuses oftentimes still adhered to a much stricter religious interpretation of the world. Education as well. By the way, that whole issue over religion is going to get much more intense as we get into the 1910s and 1920s. Education. The public tax-supported education continued to grow. All right, so we see more and more tax-supported schools, particularly elementary, eventually high schools as well. The literacy rate dropped way down in this time from 20% to 11% in just 20 years, so it dropped in half. We still have 11% of our population that's illiterate, but still, that's a lot better than 20 that had been the case just 20 years before. Higher education continues to gain as well, not only private schools, but also public state-run schools that had been formed in the East Coast and now in the Midwest, thanks to the Morrill Land Grant Act. And so education really boomed across this country. All right, the press. Newspapers. Okay, well, a lot of the newspapers that formed during this time were looking to sell copies of their newspaper. So they started to focus on more sensational topics that they thought would attract more people to their newspapers and to reading them. And so they're kind of considered sensationalized, the newspapers are. Many of the newspapers focused on reforms that they wanted to see established that they thought would be good for the United States. And so they used their newspapers to promote reforms, to get the public whipped up into a frenzy about something, so hopefully the public would demand that the government do something to stop it. All right? We have a few series of examples here. Honestly, you don't need to know the specifics of these guys very much, other than to know, hey, these are some of these early reformers in the press that were trying to end corruption, end greed, end corporate dominance by hopefully giving more regulation powers to the government and to the people. All right. Famous dude you do need to know is Jacob Riis. He's a photojournalist. He does a series of famous images about how the other half lives, describing how immigrants and poorer Americans were struggling to survive in New York City and other overcrowded American cities. Henry Demarest Lloyd, Wealth Against Commonwealth, is kind of a famous attack upon corporations by Lloyd, where he's basically saying, hey, the wealthy people in this country have gotten to be so wealthy that it's bad for the rest of us. Thorstein Veblen, The Theory of the Leisure Class. Another famous newspaper writer, Charlotte Perkins Gilman as well. Woman writer, brilliant, I will tell you. We'll save most of these authors for our next unit, because these are the same names we'll see as part of the progressive unit as well. William Hope Harvey was a Westerner. He supported a silver standard. He was a spokesperson for the populists and farmers. He was one of the most popular writers that was supported by those groups. All right. Finally, post-Civil War literature that you need to be familiar with. And art. Good Lord. This stuff keeps on going. I thought I only had a few slides left. My goodness. Vice President Guinness. I need a veto. Anyways, Guinness, you awake over there? You awake, homie? No. All right. Let's get to literature. All right, literature. Horatio Alger, I talked about in class today, Rags to Riches. He wrote stories about people that were immigrants, that were poor, that through hard work and assimilating and blending into society, they became rich, wealthy, successful Americans, inspiring to a lot of Americans, also probably gave a false sense of hope to a lot of Americans that they too could become that wealthy one day. Realism is a movement that emerges in literature and art. It was a reaction to Romanticism. It tried to depict things as they actually were. It tried to better depict life as it really was. So they took out a lot of the colorful, fanciful, flowery language, and they really tried to just be more simplistic in their writing style and reflect the actual lives of the people that they were chronicling. Mark Twain is one of our most famous realists. Another guy named Bret Hart, Stephen Crane. These are just some of the authors that you need to be familiar with from that movement. When it came to art, we had a realist school. Winslow Homer was our most famous. You'll notice, hey, a lot of grays, a lot of blacks in terms of the colors that they use. They almost never used bright colors anymore, kind of to reflect the industrial period that we were in, maybe the environmental and pollution, the environmental damage, the pollution, and just really tried to depict a more realistic version of life that people were experiencing instead of that romanticism that we saw with the Hudson River School and some of those other movements before. All right. Thomas Eakins. Oh, by the way, Winslow Homer, very famous, painted a lot of like ocean images. Whistler and Eakins, also very famous realists. Here, for instance, is Whistler's arrangement of his mother, the artist's mother. And then a group that was formed that really took advantage of these realist schools was called the Ashcan School as well. All right, so there you have it. An hour and 18 minutes. Wow, Mr. M, you did pretty good there. I must say. Now, let's take a look here at what we're doing. How's my boy? My boy is asleep. Isn't he? Oh, there's my webcam. Hi, Guinea. I've put him to sleep. Hopefully. I haven't done the same to you. All right, Mr. M and my vice president, we're signing off. And we hope that this helped you to get through the industrialism notes, the urbanization notes, I should say. Questions, problems, concerns, I hope you'll let me know. Until then, it's Mr. M. I'm signing off. Have a lovely night.